Well, hello everyone. Welcome to MacDermid Enthone's discussion on the basics of PEARLBRITE, a satin nickel process. My name is Robert Collin. I am the Americas Technical Manager and will be the moderator for this event today. The presenter, Chrissy Polera, is the Decorative Business Development and Product Manager for Decorative Coatings. Please submit the questions you have in the question box within this webinar. We will answer them via conclusion of this webinar. Thank you all again for attending the basics of PEARLBRITE, which is a satin nickel process. And with that, Chrissy, the session is yours.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you everyone for joining me today as I discuss with you our MacDermid Enthone satin nickel processes. I'll take you through a little bit about the basics of satin nickel, how these deposits are formed, some of the MacDermid Enthone processes, some of the things to look for, and then the operating conditions of these systems. So PEARLBRITE, or our satin nickel finish, it really does add some level of luster and attractiveness, of course, to these finishes. It definitely gives it a higher level, and we see these on, in a lot of applications. But it can be utilized not just under chrome, which is what we typically see, but it can be utilized under gold, silver, and trivalent chrome. And so a lot of people think that this matte finish or level of matte finish comes from the chrome, and it actually comes from the nickel layer underneath. I can get varying ranges of color and gloss, and DOI, which is distinctness of image, so how reflective that finish is, by altering either the chemistry that I'm using, the amount of it, the time I'm in the tank, etc. But again, really adds some luster and some attractiveness to these finishes. Again, a wide variety of applications that you'll see these on, anywhere from jewelry to automotive. We see them on hardware and furniture, appliances, plumbing, etc. We have a variety of approvals at the OEM level. As you can see here, essentially every automotive OEM has at least one satin finish approved. And there are several different satin finishes that are available. You see here, this is just a snapshot of our automotive OEM finishes and the approvals, which can be found on our website. But this just shows you some of the approvals at Bentley, BMW, Dacia, Daimler, and FCA. But you can see we offer the K5, the K6, the K6AL, etc. So hundreds of approved and mastered finishes. And so I want to talk about the difference between, an approval and getting some masters. And so there are several different ways that this process works depending on the OEM. If it is a new finish, if an OEM is trying to design a new finish, they might not have a master yet. They might ask us or one of our customers to help them develop a master based on something that they've seen or something that they have in mind. And that's something that we can help do, and we help with in many circumstances. The other situation would be that there already is a master and they have asked an applicator to match that master to see if they can source that work to that applicator. And we help our applicators master these finishes as well, match those masters. In the cases of new finishes, we have some right now that we're working on at the OEM level. So not only will we help them develop the master, but we will then provide hundreds of masters for them to distribute. So this involves plating, probably close to 200 masters, so they can go through them all and have 100 to distribute at the applicator level. So it's important that we understand how these operate, how to exactly match these finishes. It needs to be precise, obviously, because we don't want to have different masters out there, because once you're matching to the master and then assemble them on a vehicle, we want to make sure that those finishes are all matched up. And we track these and make sure that they can be reducible at a variety of locations. So obviously an OEM doesn't want to have to single source a finish. So we make sure that this chemistry and the process can be reproducible at a variety of locations and keep that supply chain viable for them. So how do I achieve a satin finish from a chemistry standpoint? What makes that finish, when I look at it, a pure satin? So if I look on the left, this is my standard bright, glossy, shiny finish. And what basically happens here, because that surface is so smooth and uniform, is that once that light comes in, it reflects off. So I have a perpendicular angle there, and that light that I see, that finish that I see, is bright. In the case of a satin or a matte finish, because of the way the satin distributes and deposits itself on the surface, I don't have that same reflectivity and perpendicular angle of reflection that I do with a bright finish. So because it is rough, that light gets diffused, which ultimately ends up with us seeing a satin or matte appearance. So how does this happen in the bath? So during the plating process, what's actually happening in the satin nickel bath is that the pH is rising at the surface of my part that's in solution. And when this happens, when this pH increases, I have a small droplet of emulsion that forms near the surface. So our satin nickel chemistries are emulsions. They are not homogeneous solutions, but we can see the satin moving around in there, if you will. So these small microemulsions are in there. These small droplets form on the surface when that pH changes. And they don't stay there, so they'll temporarily adhere to the surface. And when they do that, they inhibit plating at that specific location. But as those parts are moving around in solution, and as that solution is moving around itself with a little bit of agitation, that droplet gets washed away and plating is allowed to resume in that area. And this continues to happen over and over again while these parts are in that solution for, let's say, 10 to 12 minutes of plating. So you see here, I have my copper layer, my semi-bright, and my satin nickel is on top of that, forming that rough surface. And there are a variety of structures or topographies that I can achieve with my satin finishes. So if you see this picture on the left, my larger, higher density structure. So these are larger particles. I have a more matte appearance. On the bottom, on the right, I have some smaller particles, less dense structure. So this finish is going to tend to be brighter or less matte. So this is what my satin finish looks like. And this is what my multi-layer nickel will look like when I'm replacing satin with bright. And really that's all that's happening. In my multi-layer nickel construction, I'm replacing satin nickel with bright nickel. So I have my topography, my electroless nickel, my strike, then my acid copper, followed by semi-bright, high sulfur if we need it, and then either satin or bright, in this case satin, and then my microporous and my chrome. So again, it is that nickel layer, that satin nickel layer, that is giving me that appearance. And then I have microporous and my flash of chrome on top. And this is what that process cycle will look like. So the biggest difference in this process cycle, aside from switching out the bright for the satin, is that I need to incorporate some rinsing steps in between. So if you had joined me for my electrolytic nickel webinar, we were able to go from semi-bright to high sulfur to bright to microporous, all without any rinsing in between. In this case, I need to add some rinses in there. So semi-bright, high sulfur if I need it, depending on the application. And then I'm going into my rinses before the PEARLBRITE. Following the PEARLBRITE, I have some more cold water rinses, and then I'm into my microporous nickel. The rest of that process and the process before is the same. It's really just adding some rinses before and after. So before PEARLBRITE, again, I don't want to drag in any semi-bright. bright or high sulfur nickel into that plating solution. Ideally, I have 1 to 2 immersion rinses with a spray in between. And then again, after that PEARLBRITE process, I do not want to introduce any of that solution into the Durnai. I could have some wetters in those rinses after to help with cleaner surface, reduction of blisters, but again, the same 1 to 2 immersion rinses with a spray are recommended. The chemistry of the solution. So the base chemistry of a satin nickel solution is very similar to that of the bright. I have my nickel metal, sulfate and chloride in there, boric acid, specific gravity at a pH a little bit higher, 4.1 to 4.2. Again, we talked about that higher pH. We want to see that difference to achieve that finish that we need. And then I have my carriers, and then of course my satin additive, which gives me that level of matte finish depending on the effect that I'm looking to produce. But here I have my brighteners and index, the K4 carrier and the carrier H in all of my PEARLBRITE solutions, and those give me my standard brightening and leveling that I need. And then depending on, it might be called out for me already, which additive to use based on an OEM application, or I might need to determine that based on the level of the grain structure that I need or the level of satin that I'm looking for. But the PEARLBRITE K4, K5, K6, K6AL, or the Satin Coat Pearl. So these are all the different additives that I just mentioned, and they are all a little bit different. The structure of each of these additives is a little different, which ultimately determines the appearance of that final part. So if we assume that I'm utilizing each of these additives at the same concentration, I have fine grain structures with the K4 and the K6AL, a little bit more coarse with the K6 and the Satin Coat Pearl, and then more coarse with the K5. And that determines the appearance. So if I am more metallic or more aluminum-like, or if I have an intermediate or full matte finish. And if you think about, we talked about earlier, what those grain structures look like when I have very fine grain, they're smaller and less satiny. If I have larger grain, they're larger, so I have a more satin matte finish, ultimately. Operating conditions of these systems. So temperature, pretty much standard temperatures here that I'm running in nickel solutions, maybe a little bit lower here, 122 to 132. Don't want to run them too hot. Current density of 30 to 50 amps per square foot at the cathode, 20 amps per square foot at the anode. And I'm in that bath, again, very similar to bright nickel, 10 to 12 minute plate time, achieving a plating thickness of 10 microns a minute. So how does this plating occur? You know, I mentioned that there is an emulsion, and so there's a microemulsion. There's very small particles of organics in here that are depositing on the surface, temporarily disrupting the plating, inserting these small circular structures on the surface that ultimately give us a very uniform appearance depending on the concentration of that additive and how long those parts are in the tank. Some of the issues with this is that, you know, emulsions are governed by the laws of physics, so they're not stable solutions. So we need to take care of that and figure out the best way to operate these systems. So what happens with these additives is that they agglomerate. They will come together over time and will form larger particles in the solution. So if I have very fine crystalline solutions, I need to be careful to keep them that way as my bath is running. If my particles become larger, they are going to change the appearance of the deposit. So things that will affect this agglomeration are time, so how long this emulsion is in the tank, the concentration of the emulsion, and the agitation that is going on in the tank. And so we need to filter them. And there are two different ways to filter these agglomerates. But in any case, whichever way I choose, I need to make sure that those agglomerates are being filtered. And there are two ways to do so. One of them is a daily or batch filtration. So this is basically running your satin bath for one shift and then filtering that entire bath out, filtering the satin out of the system. That deposit will slightly change during that 8 to 12 hour shift. So it's typical halfway through the shift, 4 hours in, to give your bath a 10 to 15% add of fresh satin solution to prevent that finish from changing dramatically. Again, we want to make sure that that finish is consistent over time. Once that shift is complete, we filter the entire solution out through carbon. We clean the tank, we clean the anode bags, and then that solution is returned back to the tank. And that's utilized a lot when there's not a lot of satin work being run. If I'm maybe saving all of my satin work for, let's say, a Friday, I'll run one batch filtration. One batch of satin, then filter the bath out and go back in. Even if I am running it more than one day a week, if there's not 24/7 production, a lot of times it does not make sense to utilize continuous filtration. And that is my other option, is to utilize continuous filtration. And this can be done if I'm operating on more than one shift. The deposit stays a lot more uniform during this period because I am bleeding out used solution and feeding in fresh solution while the bath is running. I can do this 24 hours a day. I can operate like this 24 hours a day for 6 days. We recommend on day 7 that tank is maintained, everything is cleaned out, and then I can return it back to the tank. There is higher chemistry usage when doing continuous filtration versus batch, but you'll find that you do get a much more uniform deposit by utilizing a continuous filtration system. Agitation is a very important part of this process. We do recommend 2 or 3 dimensional mechanical agitation, especially when we're talking about these difficult geometries and parts that we often see so much now on vehicles and in other applications. So we don't just want, for example, up and down or back and forth, but some mix of 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional agitation that really helps these parts move, that could knock off air bubbles, again, without having air in the system. Air must not be used. The only time you're going to utilize air agitation is when you're mixing the satin additive when you're making up the bath. Air can cause some appearance defects, such as worms or pigtails or pore nests. So we want to avoid that as much as possible. Hull cells, again, is with any chemistry, really is the best way to determine if your bath is running appropriately. For these satin nickel systems, either a 5-minute 3-amp or 10-minute 2-amp panel is recommended to see if your satin nickel finish is appropriate. Again, mechanical agitation should also be utilized in the hull cell, no air, and we want to make sure that we see no pitting on the hull cell, and that will help us determine that that bath is running appropriately. When I filter that bath out, the hull cell is a great way for us to determine if we've gotten all of the satin solution out, whether I am finishing up my continuous filtration and doing maintenance, or I'm running my batch and I go in the next morning. I want to make sure that all of that satin has been removed. And the best way to do that is just to make sure that you have a fully bright hull cell panel to make sure it's all removed. Makeup of that system, typical 6 to 8 hours. I want to filter it out if I've had something in that tank before. If this is a makeup of the next day, for example, after a batch treatment, I want to make sure all of the carbon has been removed, all of the satin has been removed. My surface tension at that point should be higher than 55 to 60 dynes per centimeter. That's how I know that my solution is clean. And then, of course, I can check it with a hull cell. We always want to dilute the additives, and these dilutions are specified in the TDS for each system, but I want to dilute my satin additive with DI water and add it to the tank very slowly. It's also preferable adding it at or under solution level, typically into the weir, so that I'm not introducing any air. I don't want to add it all at one time. It's also really important that I don't have any cross-contamination from other processes. So anything that I'm using to mix or add or transfer solutions with for satin should be solely used for satin nickel on its own. We don't want to have anything that's being utilized for the bright nickel, semi-bright, for example. We want all the satin nickel to have its own equipment. And that, of course, helps us control the color and the appearance of our parts, which is very important. You know, we talked about masters and matching a master. You know, it takes some finesse to plate satin nickel. You have to make sure that those baths are running well. You have to make sure that we're checking replenishment dosing pumps, for example, making sure they're calibrated on a regular basis so that we're feeding in the same amount of satin all the time. And that means ultimately I'm getting the same finish on that part all the time. That filtration flow rate needs to be adjusted to correct for color also. So if I increase my filter rate, I'm removing more additive, which means I'm going to decrease my satin effect. Conversely, if I decrease my flow, I'm replenishing more additive, and we're talking about here that feed and bleed system, that continuous filtration. So if my flow rate is lower than my replenishment additive, obviously I have more satin, so it's going to be more matte. So I need to make sure that that feed and bleed is optimized, that it's even and balanced, so that I have a stable and consistent satin effect throughout the course of, you know, those 6 days. I'm still running, you know, that same finish on day 6 that I was on day 1. Some other things that might influence the appearance of my finish. I need to make sure that that solution is moving. So solution agitation, cathode agitation, optimizing those are essential for getting that uniform deposit. If I don't have enough movement, that solution's not moving, I could have too much satin in one area. So I don't want these baths to be rolling by any sense. It is a very slow and consistent agitation level in the satin nickel baths. Just as too low of an agitation could give me more satin, so could thick deposits. Obviously, the more that I'm building up in there, the more satin I'm going to see when I look at that part ultimately when it comes off the line. Thin deposits, on the other hand, are going to be dull but non-uniform. So I'm not going to have a uniform satin appearance from high to low current density area. So I want to make sure that my deposit is thick enough. And that's usually, if there is an OEM specification, that'll be called out in there. Another thing that can be difficult with satin nickels is that variation between high and low current density areas. So if there's severe high and low current density areas on a part, it will show that satin effect differently in those areas. It's ideal to use the lowest possible current density that you can on these parts to ensure a uniform deposit. And there are a lot of things that can be done. You know, I've seen some pretty difficult parts run, and we've adjusted racking or the amount of parts on the rack just to make sure that we're optimizing, you know, making that deposit as even as we can from high to low, possibly adding some shielding to prevent a lot of satin being deposited in one area versus a little in the other. So there are ways to help if there are difficult parts. And obviously, you know, we see more and more complex geometries as time goes on. So there are ways to do that, but satin nickel does take some finesse to plate. So that concludes my session today on our PEARLBRITE nickel systems. I do encourage you, if you have any questions about satin nickel operation or the PEARLBRITE systems specifically, please don't hesitate to email me. And thank you again for your attention today, and please stay safe.
Thanks, Chrissy. Another excellent section on the basics of our PEARLBRITE system for satin nickel processing. Again, as Chrissy had just said, please contact Chrissy Player directly for the questions you have if you did not write them in the question box. Again, thank you all very much. Have yourselves a great day.